And actually, both terms had a very, very long history in architectural theory, with various understandings from Vitruvius through Alberti and Le Corbusier. So basically, the major question that our panelists today will be addressing is the way Catholic architecture actually negotiates the relation between abstraction and materiality, since both of them are actually deeply embedded in the very foundation of Catholic tradition. Some of the topics that we'll be hearing today deal with the idea of the difference between holistic and fragmentary abstraction, the difference between Eastern and Western abstraction, between traditional and modern abstraction, between the finite and the infinite. The relevance of proportions in sacred architecture is another topic, and we're looking forward to hearing what the paper will say about this topic that has been dealt with throughout the architectural history. And finally, we'll also hear about the Chapel of the Holy Spirit, built in Vatican, which is the only American intervention in Vatican. And I have to apologize for not introducing myself. My name is Andrea Mihalake. I had the chance to teach here at Catholic universities for several years, and now I'm currently teaching at the Washington Alexandria Architecture Center at Virginia Tech. So with that, I'd like to welcome our first presenter, Michael Tamara, who's an architect practicing in South Riding, Virginia.
All right, well, before I begin, I just want to say that I'm delighted and honored to be here, and I'd just like to say a little prayer that God may bless our efforts for His greater glory and for our increased faith, because that's, after all, what this is all about. There seems to be a certain leeriness instinctively felt by many people at the mention of abstraction in the context of sacred art and architecture, which conjures thoughts of distortion or complete disregard for recognizable reality. The automatic equating of the word abstraction with such an idea, however, places a handicap on the understanding and perpetuation of Christian expression in the built environment, which has always relied on various degrees of abstraction in order to convey the story at the heart of the faith. When dealing with eternal reality, which is itself an abstract notion because it escapes full human comprehension, the real question is not whether abstraction can call the person into fullness of humanity, but what kind of abstraction best serves to bring the person ever deeper into the fullness of his or her true identity. In order to answer the question of the nature of proper abstraction, we first must establish an accurate understanding of the relationship between the physical and spiritual dimensions of the Christian reality by asking and answering an even more fundamental question: what is the fullness of humanity? When we say we believe in the resurrection of the body in the Apostles' Creed, we acknowledge that not only do body and soul begin as a unified whole, but they are also, though separated at death, destined to be reunited on the day of judgment in imitation of Christ. In this manner, the human and the divine are inseparably linked. If this is true, then our understandings of the nature of humanity and divinity are codependent. If we do not know ourselves, then we cannot fully know God. And if we do not know God, then we cannot truly know ourselves and what it means to be fully human. From the very beginning, the Church has taught that each and every human person is a sacred being created in the image and likeness of the Creator. We may liken the Lord's original intent for humankind and the world, indeed for reality in its totality, to a state of perpetual holism. Holism, as defined herein, simply refers to all parts being aware of and working together in free obedience and acknowledgement of the whole, living in harmony with God, each other, and all of nature. Man's eventual desire to be equal with God and subsequent misuse of free will caused a fragmentation of the whole, scattering the logic and simplicity of existence into scrambled incoherence, thus putting into motion salvation history. Whereas creation entailed the wrapping of humanity in a mantle of godliness, we can say that salvation was accomplished by the exact inverse, the gracious choice of God to be wrapped in a mantle of humanness in order to wash away sin and open the gates of heaven. Through the mystery of the hypostatic union, that is, the perfect union of both God and man in the person of Jesus Christ, the fullness of humanity was restored. As the Son of Man, he is the complete human, the resurrection and the life. His resurrection in a glorified body foreshadows the destiny of all of his followers, body and soul reunited, the prevailing of holism once again. The various effective ways in which the story at the heart of the faith has been and continues to be conveyed in sacred art and architecture all have a critical common starting point. They employ architecture and the visual arts at the complete service of faith, as opposed to trying to force the faith to submit to a predetermined and alien concept. The avenue by which this expression of holism is accomplished, we may call holistic abstraction. Holistic abstraction takes familiar physical and architectural forms, those which are recognizably human, and transforms them only enough to allow them to become higher than themselves, to become glorified, to reach toward the divine. Holistic abstraction is the way the built environment mimics human destiny, and that it begins with the natural and stretches it into the supernatural. As early as the 4th century, we see holistic abstraction already being employed. In the depiction of the bearded Christ in the catacombs of Comedilla outside of Rome, incredibly limited and primitive imagery is used to capture the entire essence of Jesus. The Alpha and the Omega serve as bookends between the figure of Christ with a halo, causing his very human appearance to cross with the divine, and making for a concise representation of the hypostatic union in fresco form. It may seem like a stretch to call this very elementary example abstract, but it goes beyond depicting Jesus simply as he appeared when he walked the earth, hence alluding to the holistic understanding of who Jesus really is. Later in the first millennium, we see the evolution of a style of holistic abstraction called iconography. Icons illustrate particularly well the timelessness of the faith, as many of them bear a striking resemblance to certain modern styles of sacred art. Icons take basic human forms, those of Christ or the saints, and show them not exactly as they appeared in life, but in the glorified heavenly state in which we believe they now dwell. In a typical icon, only visible body parts such as faces and hands are given depth, with all other areas remaining flat, and drapery often executed in a highly stylized fashion. One is meant to focus on the heads and faces, which is why light seems to emit from within the holy person in an icon painting rather than being cast upon from without. When we talk about a building, the bridge between the human and the divine should be just as much of a concern as if we were talking about an actual depiction of a holy person. Sacred architecture should have human qualities that its beholders can subconsciously appreciate and in turn offer back to God in the form of praise and thanksgiving. To find a clear illustration of this, the Gothic style is an excellent place to look because it emerged chiefly for the essentially holistic purpose of conveying man's destiny for God. When we look at the jamb figures at Chartres Cathedral, we see sculpture having become an organic part of the architecture in the form of various saints and angels welcoming all who enter. These figures are not naturalistic earthly people, but transformed heavenly beings, humanoid in appearance as in the icon tradition. In this case, the primary method of holistic abstraction is to take the body and actually stretch it, making the figure far too tall to be believable as naturalistic reality. This, coupled with the lightness of the drapery and the elevated placement of the sculptures, makes for a light, floating quality despite their material composition of stone. This idea of vertical elongation extends into the structural architecture of the cathedrals themselves. The components of a column in the classical world, base, shaft, and capital, were very respectful of human proportions and sacred geometry based off of the human body. The Gothic builders took the human-like qualities of the classical column and transformed them like the jamb figures, growing them ever higher and thinner in order to reach heaven. Here, what matters most are lightness, tallness, and brightness, taking the human and making it reach for the divine, holistic abstraction par excellence that challenges previously held notions of a building's limits by organically growing out of what was already familiar. 17th century Baroque churches of the Counter-Reformation pushed limits in a different way. Architecture, painting, and sculpture morphed together into a single, seamless Gesamtkunstwerk, or total work of art, in service of a reinvigorated telling of the story at the heart of the faith. Ceilings were ideal places for the expression of the big picture of human destiny, as can be seen in the Church of Il Gesù in Rome. Here we see illustrated the epitome of the characteristically Baroque blurring of art and architecture, to the point where we can't tell where the architecture ends and the painting and sculpture begin. Thanks to a masterful use of holistic abstraction, we are less concerned with the actual shape of the ceiling as we are with what is going on in the center, where it broke open to reveal heaven. Like the Gothic cathedral, we are called to a higher reality, but in a very different way, thus illustrating the great diversity of expression afforded by the proper attitude of abstraction. A large-scale model of modern holistic abstraction can be found in the Notre-Dame du Sacré-Cœur chapel in the Basilica of Notre-Dame in Montreal, rebuilt after a devastating 1978 fire. The bottom two levels, in keeping with the traditional style of the rest of the building, give way to a very modern vaulting system that appears to be levitating over the rest of the architecture, completely unsupported by the columns below. Natural light cascades from around the vault and bathes a massive bronze relief altarpiece depicting the march of humanity toward God, the theme of which is the very definition of a holistic understanding of the fullness and purpose of humanity. The chapel at once lifts the person to God and draws God down to the human level. If eternal life is the destiny of humanity, then those of us in this earthly life are on a journey toward the complete realization of the holism restored by the Paschal sacrifice, but not there yet. When faith and reason are divorced, fragmentation easily eclipses holism once again. What all of the major secular forces at work over the past few centuries have in common, be they philosophical, socioeconomic, or political, is a general tendency toward, if not outright profession of, atheism. Divinity has been deleted. Humanity is all there is. The irony in this is that without God, there really is no such thing as innate human value. Fullness of humanity cannot come from humanity, and therefore cannot exist in a godless vacuum. The utter helplessness, anxiety, and fragmentation bred by this disconnection with our true identity have translated into the saluting of depression, hopelessness, and pointlessness by putting them into artistic inbuilt form. Sorry about that. If we call that abstraction which humanizes and tells the story at the heart of the faith holistic, then that abstraction which dehumanizes and resists faith can be called fragmentary, because it is fundamentally disengaged from the larger understanding that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God and therefore destined to return to God. When man begins to sincerely believe he is his own highest authority, reality becomes arbitrary, and those with power can rewrite the rules endlessly to suit their whim. An architectural answer to a glaring 20th century example of fragmentation and dehumanization is the Jewish Museum in Berlin. In this context, the fragmentary abstraction employed is suitable given the terrible historical events it commemorates. The coldness, jaggedness, and sharp lacerations in the outer shell are evocative of the physical wounds and torture of the Jewish people under Nazi rule, and all the metal faces on the floor represent humanity symbolically being trampled underfoot. Here, fragmentary abstraction is not promoting dehumanization, but rather it is simply serving to tell of a particular instance of acutely brutal dehumanization that occurred as the result of a massive forsaking of the fullness of humanity. Elsewhere, though, fragmentary abstraction often occurs simply because its designers and proponents believe that it actually represents the extent of the human condition. Such a case is the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. In as charitable a way as possible, we simply ask, where is God in this? If the answer is nowhere, we have no need for God, then we ask, where is humanity? Although there are many pieces of good modern secular architecture worthy of celebration, much of it seems to have become, first and foremost, about existing primarily for the purpose of itself and its authors, with the function of the building and the people who daily use and inhabit it being of secondary importance. Since the church, though not of the world, lives in the world, it is only logical that fragmentary thinking, if allowed, can enter through a crack in God's temple, so to speak, despite the holism of the faith itself. For want of a more nuanced way of putting it, fragmentary abstraction simply seized upon 20th century opportunities to wedge its way into the church, first in thought, and then proceeding logically in sacred art and architecture. It is not within the scope of this paper to analyze why or exactly how such a thing happened, but simply to point out that it did and to examine some of the physical consequences. The puzzlement of many faithful at the appearance of much church architecture of the past half-century cannot be dismissed as resistance to change or mere nostalgia alone, but perhaps is due in part to the very pronounced difference between holistic and fragmentary abstraction being played out in front of them. Fragmentary abstraction, let us recall, is skeptical of the revealed relationship between God and humanity in Scripture and sacred tradition, and instead finds the extent of reality in the minds of each individual. By nature, then, it is often highly subjective and ambiguous, as exemplified in the work of the abstract expressionist painter Mark Rothko. Brilliant colors and compositions aside, if one were to ask 12 people what they're looking at when they view a typical painting, one would get 12 different answers. To see the result of such abstraction applied to sacred architecture, we may look at the Rothko Chapel in Houston, Texas. Originally intended to be a Catholic sacred space, we have a prime example of the questions left unanswered by the use of fragmentary abstraction where holistic abstraction is required. The particular manipulation of natural lighting conveys a certain sense of the spiritual, but spirituality alone, when divorced from theology, is an incredibly general and subjective thing. What is the universal story, literally the Catholic story, this space tells? How are we taught about the fullness of humanity we possess as children of God? What we see as complete spiritual otherworldliness at the ceiling level, that is, the disembodied light, without that spirituality personifying itself in any universally understandable way. At the lower level, where we might expect that personification to happen, we instead see large, imposing canvases of black. Does this work for the telling of the story of the hypostatic union in which the great I Am is personified? Do we see a balanced expression of divinity and humanity? Contrast this with Notre Dame du Sacré-Cœur. Both are modern churches with natural overhead lighting, but with very different results. An idea of conveying the sacred simply by light and shapes is a theme that repeats through many other examples, one of which is the Jubilee Church in Rome. I happen to like this building as a general piece of architecture, but our topic here centers on its effectiveness as a church. Although surfaces washed in light and the consequent shadows produced hint at the spiritual, there is little recognizable human dimension through the use of iconography, proportionality, or significant material texture differentiation throughout. Aside from the dark traditional crucifix that sharply contrasts with the vast sea of mostly smooth whiteness, where do we see any other elements that call us into the appropriate frame of mind for the celebration of the sacred mysteries? Without that crucifix, we could easily be looking at the interior of a large greenhouse, an airport terminal or train station, or the atrium of an upscale shopping mall. Upscale. Nice one. This certainly was not the effect intended by the architect, but the people in the pews shouldn't need to worry about verbal explanations if the building itself is didactically strong. If symbolism is not universal and is therefore ambiguous, it can and likely will be lost on the masses. For example, it may not be immediately apparent that the three large curved walls are intended to represent the Trinity. This is because their allusion to the Trinity is not necessarily obvious simply because of their number. After all, we could look at the Sydney Opera House and see similar repetitions of three, but they obviously have nothing to do with the Trinity or any other theological idea. Inside the nave of the Jubilee Church, what we see when we look up is worth comparing to what we see when we look up in another Roman church, Sant'Ignazio. Which one of these most clearly tells of humanity's new lease on life as a result of the incarnation in God's sacrifice for us? As in Il Gesù, the scene of the heavens opening in Sant'Ignazio is certainly not one you would see in nature, but it uses natural and recognizable elements in a new and different way in order to express the supernatural. Upon entering the Jubilee Church, we simply see the same thing we saw outside through glass and mullions. Some would call this an unfair comparison given the radical difference in styles and materials, which is understandable. But this is not about style or material per se. The Baroque ceiling could be replaced with any number of other styles, including modern, that convey the completeness of the Christian story. The comparison of these particular two churches is used simply because it epitomizes holistic abstraction versus fragmentary abstraction as defined herein. In one, we see the supernatural whole. In the other, though the natural sky has an incredible beauty all its own, we nevertheless see only the literally visible piece of that whole. The world is full of examples of both holistic and fragmentary abstraction in architecture, and our purpose here has not been to do an exhaustive account, but simply to show that certain abstraction is good and necessary in Catholic architecture in order to perceive the relationship between the seen and unseen. For all that we don't know about God, there is plenty that we do know, not by virtue of our own senses or assumptions, but through the singular choice of that very God to reveal himself to us throughout the ages. Our vocation as designers of sacred places, then, is finding the appropriate balance in visual and physical expression between the human and the divine. I thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. And our next speaker today is Joel Pidle, who's a practicing architect in New York City.
All right. These are, the images that I have are going to be illustrative of just a particular point in my talk as opposed to my talk being specifically in reference, trying to explain the images. So, the question, the story at the heart of faith, can abstraction call the person to the fullness of humanity? I'd like to begin with two terms that I'm going to use rather ubiquitously through my talk. The first is contemplation as opposed to abstraction. When I use contemplation, what I mean is the total imagination involving all of our faculties, thinking, feeling, remembering, hoping, believing, perceiving, abstracting, conceiving, and interpreting, and thus constituting the fullness of our humanity. The other term I will use is analogical. It's a theological term, but also has an artistic dimension to it. By this I mean proceeding according to a proper proportion or measure. It is the principle of unity in difference between the part and the whole, the particular and the universal, essentia and esse, becoming and being, the finite and the infinite, where the contraries are so integrated and mutually dependent and informing that to preference one to the expense of the other is to distort the way we contemplate, create, and live in the world. So, the titular question as it relates to architecture, specifically sacred architecture, possesses a rather enigmatic character because architecture is an essentially abstract art, at least if we mean that in any iconic sense of the term. In fact, abstraction in a certain sense is precisely the power of the imagination that renders the entire creative artistic enterprise possible. Thus, defining its usage and meaning as it more narrowly is evidence in architecture will constitute the first part of this presentation, highlighting examples of the types of architectural abstraction realized in built works. Following this, I will suggest that abstraction, thus defined in light of the Christological form given to the world and the specific purpose of sacred architecture in realizing this form, is too limited and narrow to call the person into the fullness of humanity, at least if the invitation is understood to be a definite, concrete one, the imitation of Christ, in which the voice doing the calling adequately represents the fullness of life which it is drawing the person into. Instead, I will submit that contemplation, as exemplified in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola, is in fact the proper noia of the architectural imagination, and that this noia is typified by the analogical imagination manifest in the dramatic event structure of traditional architectural forms. Abstraction is not the exclusive province of modern art or architecture in particular. It enjoys its proper place in both Eastern and Western traditions. However, there are essential differences within these traditional forms of abstraction, and furthermore, between modern abstraction and traditional abstraction. These distinctions depend on differing worldviews, either implicitly or explicitly, more than mere stylistic preference, and hence the aesthetic concern is actually one of theological provenance. In Balthasarian terms, it is a question of theological aesthetics. At the risk of oversimplifying and generalizing traditional abstraction for the sake of succinction, I would suggest that traditional forms of abstraction remain predominantly inspired by and expressive of natural forms and causes. That is, they are representative of the analogical imagination. Thus, they share many broad similarities reflecting their common dependency on the human form, natural scales, harmonies, and proportions, and a belief in a divinely ordered cosmos made intelligible in and through creation. In short, all these traditional forms demonstrate architecture as the art whereby man, as a relational, rational being, manifests, orients, and transforms his relationships with God, his neighbor, and creation through the built world. Here, the source of their similarities or unities also becomes the summit of notable differences, namely, by the result of divergent understandings of human nature, the nature and representability of God, or the human person in relation to the divine and natural forms of this world. Its degree of abstraction is proportioned to the entire contemplative imagination. Hence, its abstraction is subsumed within and reliant upon a total contemplative receptivity to the analogical forms of creation and inspiration from the divine muses. It is a world, as C.S. Lewis states, where contemplation of nature gives meaning and context to our understanding of God, and thus one where art imitates nature teleologically and analogically, not simply mimetically. Modern abstraction manifests a paradigmatic shift from the traditional emphasis on analogical forms and images to abstracted mental concepts as the locus and terminus of the architectural imagination. Here, I believe the modern transition in abstraction demonstrates a rational reductionism on the part of the architectural imagination, analogous to that which is pointedly assessed and analyzed by Father William Lynch in his book, Christ and Apollo. Some of you may or may not be familiar with that book, but you should definitely read it if you get a chance. This reductionism comes in three forms: the indefinite imagination, the univocal imagination, and the equivocal imagination, none of which correspond with or reinforce our experience of the real world. The indefinite imagination is usually characterized by simplified forms which preference an atmosphere that hints at but never fully develops a formal grammar of ornament, detail, scale, or refined proportional relationships that properly contextualize the whole. In many cases, the indefinite imagination implies a purposeful blurring or simplification of traditional architectural forms in an attempt to give an aesthetic impression. It is concretized metaphor as opposed to true analogy. By this, I mean that the indefinite imagination represents likeness, a derivative image that can never stand as representative of any seminal form itself. Since the general or universal is only found instantiated in particulars from which they are then abstracted, and not the converse, it is only the actual precedent from which these forms are being abstracted that give rise to the impression which the abstracted forms are attempting to replicate or allude to. Hence, for example, and this is the example of the Ave Maria oratory that exemplifies this, any attempt to realize a general Gothicness will only end in failure unless it is an attempt to be truly Gothic in all of its particularity. So basically here we just have forms that are referencing Gothic forms, but are not capable of giving the full expression of Gothicness because it fails to address the particulars that are evidenced in Gothic architecture. And thus there's a certain vagueness or generality of it. The univocal imagination is not plagued by the same generalization or vagueness of imagination endemic to the indefinite. In fact, it is absolutized unity, as old as the philosophy of Parmenides. The univocal imagination arises from the rational impulse for abstracting, organizing, and unifying, which can be a powerful logical tool for the architectural imagination in creating points of mental coherence that become intelligible in the architectural experience. The power of the univocal imagination reduces the whole to a singularly essential but ultimately narrow point of reference as the seminal idea from which the whole is originated, resolved, and measured. The parts are externalized and instrumentalized in relation to the whole, admitting of no apparent integration except as unrelated features. The whole work is thereby able to be viewed from a single point whose reference and meaning actually lie just outside of the architectural image, as if imposed from above, as opposed to embedded within it and revealed by a process of unfolding through time and space. Hence, the architectural experience is reduced to a rational grasping of a concept, symbol, or meeting of the minds of the viewer and the architect from the vantage point of an idea that is above, behind, around the architectural itself. In so doing, it precisely delimits the nature of the vision and admits of no further vision. It can only and ever be a sign rather than a symbol, a signature key, but never the whole symphony. As Lynch states, while its forms are certainly the clearest or the most defined representations of human cognition, as images or points of identification with the real, they are the most distant, the most shadowy of all human modes of intelligence. This is an example of the St. Jose Maria Escriva shrine in Mexico, in which the architect is attempting, the plan of this building is in the shape of the ichthus, the fish, and as it rises, it turns into parallel lines, which are an attempt to try to denote the infinite. So, the equivocal imagination, as the converse of the univocal imagination, evinces the opposite tendencies to emphasize differentiation or separation to the exclusion of unification. It is absolutized difference, or the equivalent of serial music. To its credit, its emphasis on the absolute particularity and the individuation of elements grants the forms a powerful autonomy, whereby any attempt to reduce the architectural experience to a particular instance or moment or some essential point outside of the present is thwarted. Every experience thus becomes unique and unrepeatable. However, in its attempt to avoid any visible unifying factor, the result is a created world in which discrete parts never amount to an intelligible whole, a creative equation written only with variables and not constants. It posits a universe without unified meaning, or rather, whose meaning is precisely that there is no final meaning, only localized subjective meanings, because it lacks a center through which its gyrated forms hold together, no unifying feature to resolve the points of dissimilarity into an ordered or teleological pattern of experience. It is an imagination haunted by the ghosts of Descartes, Darwin, and Schoenberg. Examples of this would be such things as the Los Angeles Cathedral or any Frank Gehry building. In this case, this is the quote is straight from the website. Mineo has designed a dynamic contemporary cathedral with virtually no right angles. This geometry contributes to the cathedral's feeling of mystery and aura of majesty. And I'm not quite sure how that actually is accomplished by the lack of right angles, but at the heart of these modern abstractions is the worldview that opposes contraries as contradictories, that sees the worlds of ideas, signs, and concepts rather than concrete forms and images as the source for transcending the finite, where the rationalizing aspect of the imagination is preferenced over the total contemplative imagination, of which abstraction is only a part. As such, abstraction can only reveal or appeal to a partial reality. In every attempt to resolve these tensions of existence into either of the two poles of being, essentia or esse, unity or difference, the proper relationship between the finite and the infinite in the architectural image is distorted, hence the actual theological nature of what is often seen as merely an aesthetic concern. The resulting forms which are given for our imaginative consumption are signs rather than symbols, which are closed to the reality that they are meant to signify, either delimited by the concept of the mind that conceived them, or unable to find the whole that would bind their disparate, unrelated meanings into a meaningful unity. The analogical imagination accepts that the paradoxical tension at the heart of our existential condition is not a problem to be resolved, but is the very source of our creativity, whose tension must be maintained so as to avoid a reductionism into the extremes of abstraction just delineated. It reinforces our natural experience of the world as constitutive of images and patterns that cannot be reduced into an either-or, either an absolute unity or multiplicity. In traditional architecture, what are known as the orders are in fact the realization of this analogical imagination, a conceiving of architecture, like existence and life itself, as proceeding according to a pattern whose unity emerges from a series of individual parts with their own measure, scale, and proportion, even as they provide the same to the whole. The whole and the part interpenetrate so completely that one cannot be conceived or understood without reference to the other, except to the distortion of both. And it is contemplation rather than abstraction which by its very nature avoids this dichotomy. Here, space and time become the locus for unfolding of the relationship between the finite and the infinite. Musically, it is symphonic. It is the unique contribution of Christianity that this precise response to any attempt at reductionist abstraction is analogized at the very heart of our faith. For the scandal of the Incarnation demonstrates the choice between the universal and the particular, the abstract and the concrete, the finite and the infinite, action and contemplation, essentia and esse, to be false or illusory. Theologically speaking, this is evidence that any reductionism of what von Balthasar terms the concrete, universal, Christological form results in heresy, for it cannot be abstracted except to its distortion. The Christological form is not primarily an appeal to our rational faculty, ratio, as an abstraction, but rather into our entire imagination, intellectus. Recognizing this, the reception of the Christological form by our imagination and subsequent imitation constitutes the heart of St. Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises, as we are called to put on the Neue of Christ. This is achieved through grace by calling the imagination to proceed according to a proportion, or analogically, through the entire procession of Christ's life, words, silences, deeds, and images, as it is presented in the Gospels. This contemplative procession ultimately reminds us that every point of the finite is open to the infinite. And if the two can and do fully interpenetrate, then the old maxim that art imitates nature in the analogical sense can be more profoundly understood and restated as art imitates grace perfecting nature. The role of art thus becomes a visual safeguard of gratuity over against every functionalism or reductionism or essentialism, a continual reminder that everything is gift and that our every response should be one of gratitude. For art is essentially a response of gratitude for creation, arising from a love of beauty. It is here that sacred art and architecture are called to bear specific witness by calling the individual and the community to a universal act of gratitude in the imitation of the Christological form through the highly personal, specific, ritualized form of the liturgy. For sacred architecture, the analogical imagination reveals that the premise of our gratitude and the ground of our liturgical action is our creatureliness, and the recognition that it is only through this finitude that we come to the infinite. All theology, all imagination, all prayer, for which the liturgy is the source and summit, must begin with that simple realization: I am not God. I am not my own creator. I did not create the world. Proceeding according to the analogical mind, the scholastic dictum called the Analogia Entis, formally defined by the Fourth Lateran Council, posits that no matter the similarity between the creator and creature, the dissimilarity remains the greater. Thus, there must be a balance between unity and difference expressed in sacred architecture, and yet a difference which is overcome not by a unity that destroys our nature, but one that elevates and perfects it, while allowing each to remain other. Because this unity does not destroy our nature or work outside of it, only an architecture whose forms reinforce and imitate the way we experience reality according to our nature as a unified pattern of diverse relationships, or what I call a proper event structure, can draw us into that which their forms are attempting to express. It is only here that we can fully participate in the continuation of creation that makes us at home in the world, because it is a world created according to the nature of man as God's image and likeness. This balance is finally intelligibly achieved when the architecture leads us not into conceptual truths and abstracted ideas, but rather into a state of simultaneous intimacy and distance, proportionate to the relationship between creator and creature. this relationship, this simultaneous intimacy and distance, is finally experienced as reverential awe when we are not grasping God, but being grasped by him. For architecture and by extension the fine arts, this means that abstraction by itself cannot fully manifest the Christological form given to the world. In the end, such abstraction represents either an escape into or a limited correspondence with the top of the head, and thus it can only give the world half of Christ, the half without his heart. In the tradition of St. Ignatius Loyola, it is the analogical imagination typified in contemplation rather than abstraction, which should guide the architectural imagination, if such an imagination seeks to extend and transform the church in the image of Christ and the world rather than in their abstractions. Thank you. Close this one.
Thanks again for a very, very insightful paper. And I'd like to introduce our third speaker, Eric Bootsma, who's a practicing architect in Arlington, Virginia. Carmen, you hear it? This one?
Thank you. When I was writing this, I realized I could probably write several very long books about this. So much of this is probably going to be, like the previous two talks, very abstract, but I'm going to try and bring it all together as much as I can in the short period of time that I have. In his work, The 10 Books of Architecture, the Renaissance architectural theorist Leon Battista Alberti wrote that when an architect designs a beautiful building, he can look to the composition of music as a guide. He wrote, "I affirm again with Pythagoras, it is absolutely certain that nature is wholly consistent. That is how things stand. The very numbers that cause sounds to have the concinitas, the agreement of sounds, pleasing to the ears, can also fill the eyes and mind with wondrous delight." More than just giving useful advice, Alberti is making a statement about the nature of beauty. That is a natural thing, meaning the nature of the universe. Beauty acts in a similar way on similar things, such as in the way which music and architecture are similar. Alberti is convinced that music and architecture partake of the essence of beauty in the same way. And if we consent that beauty operates in this way, the understanding of the principles of beauty in music will give us a fuller understanding of how beauty operates in the realm of architecture. Now, music being an incredibly mathematical and logical art, has from the ancient Greek philosophers up until Alberti's own time a tremendous amount of theory written about it, from what had traditionally been attributed to Pythagoras to Boethius and Renaissance theorists. So drawing upon both what the ancients said about music and on to even our own contemporaries today, will shed light on what beauty is in architecture and how we might be able to create such beauty for the church today. The intent of this presentation today is to briefly explain the underlying common aesthetic principles that apply both to music and to architecture that are the reason why we call such arts beautiful. I am not, however, proposing to provide a complete and comprehensive definition of beauty, but leaving that discussion to more qualified philosophers, I rather intend only to look at the principles to be found in these particular manifestations of beauty. First, we must start with a good definition of that infinitely debatable and elusively grasped word beauty, incomplete as any definition might be. We may be able to learn from applying this definition to things said about beauty in our subjects of music and architecture. Aristotle, writing in the 2nd century BC, wrote in his Metaphysics that the most important kinds of the beautiful are order, symmetry, and definiteness. This definition of beauty, or rather these 3 essential properties of beauty, will make do for a basic discussion of how music and architecture are related and how they are beautiful. It's worth mentioning that many of these terms are oftentimes used interchangeably and in different senses, often by the same authors. I will endeavor, however, to, as much as possible, maintain a consistency of definition. Nevertheless, due to the metaphysical nature of these concepts, at times some overlap and mingling of ideas does occur. Symmetria. I would like to begin with the second of Aristotle's terms, symmetry, as it is more fundamental to the understanding of the others. The first century architect Vitruvius, in his 10 books of architecture, defined symmetry as the following. Symmetry is the appropriate harmony arising out of the details of the work itself, the correspondence of each given detail among the separate details to the form of the design as a whole. Symmetry is not meant here to be simply the notion of bilateral correspondence of one side of a building to another, though it does not exclude it in any way, but is rather a more general term for the fitting together of things. Vitruvius here uses the Latin synonym for symmetry, the word commensus. Commensus, which literally translates as the same measure, or the concept of commensurability. Boethius, a Roman philosopher writing 2 centuries after Vitruvius, uses commensus to define the musical concept of consonance, thus tying together the symmetry in architecture to music. Boethius says that consonances are necessarily to be found in those comparisons of low and high, which are commensurable with each other, that is, which have a known common measure, as for example in multiples. To be commensurate, to have a common measure, is a quality that makes a ratio, a comparison of low and high, a consonant ratio. The consonant ratios that Boethius speaks of are the same ones that Alberti referred to when he spoke of those numbers by means of which the agreement of sounds affect our ears. The most consonant ratios were discovered by Pythagoras to be the basic building blocks of the musical scale, namely 2-to-1, the octave, 3-to-2, the perfect fifth, and 4-to-3, the perfect fourth. These ratios are the ones which are the most commensurate, meaning that their common measure of 1 is very close to the number of the pitches themselves. These intervals, which are identified by all of the ancients as the most consonant of ratios, were praised by the ancients as being the most pleasing. Boethius says that a consonance is a concord of different tones whose combination is a sort of unity. That unity is possible because of their commensurability, and it is because of their commensurability is comprehensible to our mind. Boethius states that we must praise commensurate ratios because we can more easily understand them. One has to pass judgment, as in the ear is also in reason, which among all consonants is mentioned by us earlier ought to be deemed the best. For ears are affected by sounds and the eye by a sight in the same way which the judgment of the mind is affected by the numbers or continuous quantity. For given a number or a line, nothing is easier to contemplate than the double with the eye or the mind. The ratios of the musical intervals, the same ones that are recommended by Alberti for architectural composition, are not a completely arbitrary notion, but are in fact very real, tangible, and concrete, and are entirely present within the sound waves that music is made of. Looking at the wave patterns of musical ratios, the sounds, we can see what Boethius meant when he said that a consonance is a concord of different tones whose combination is a sort of unity. Consonant sounds are able to combine with each other to create a new, different, consistent waveform. The new waveform is consonant because it has a common measure between the two parts that is easily understood by the mind. And so I'm going to go through really quickly here through those waveforms. So first off, we have the 1-to-2 ratio, the octave. We can see here, this is the 1, the larger of the waves. It completes a cycle from up to down, back to 0 again, and 2, it's double. When we combine them together, we find this. And so on the right there, that is the repeating of the period of the octave. And what we find there is that in one period, the entire wave pattern of the 2-to-1 ratio repeats itself in one cycle. In the 2-to-3, it repeats in 2 cycles. In the 3-to-4, in 3 cycles. The key here is that the mind is able to perceive this commensurability, although it is not by a conscious action, but a perception of the mind. Leibniz says that music is counting performed by the mind without knowing it is counting. The mind is quite literally counts the numbers of each pitch and finds the common measure between them. The further this common measure is from the period of the combined notes, the more difficult the mind finds to count and discover the common measure. Consonant notes combine so that their common measure is apparent in the combination, having combined pattern that takes a very short period of time relative to the common measure to repeat. The octave repeats in the pattern once in this common measure, the fifth twice, and the fourth and 3 times. And here we see the 29 to 16, which is the minor seventh. It repeats in 29 cycles. I would challenge anyone to be able to see and perceive 29 in their mind. 1, 2, and 3 are easily perceptible to the mind. Dissonant sounds do not combine in any way, creating a pattern that is not at all discernible, one that takes a relatively immense period of time to repeat, 29 cycles. The minor seventh repeats the resultant pattern only after 16 periods, the smallest repeats in the 29 times the smallest common measure. The constituent parts of dissonant sounds become lost in the chaos of the resulting wave pattern in a very real way. So rather than creating a unity, the sounds, as Boethius say, confusedly mix with each other. In consonant sounds, the constituent parts are not lost in the chaos, but rather create a new pattern different from both parts, but remaining internally consistent and creating a unity in the mind as well as mathematically. This is the concept of symmetry, that each part fits together and is commensurate in such a way that the human mind is able to count or grasp the concept in one single unity. In the musical ratios, the octave, the fifth, and such, one finds such a unity, the symmetry, to be both pleasing both to the eye and to the ear. Order. Aristotle's first criteria of beauty is that of order. Order is that arrangement of multiple parts in a coherent way. St. Thomas Aquinas and Vitruvius also named this property of beauty to be proportion. Proportion is a relationship of at least 3 things, whereas symmetry or consonance is a relationship of 2 magnitudes, or at least a simple ratio. Order or proportion is best thought of as a ratio of ratios. Vitruvius says that beauty will be had when the works will have a pleasing and elegant appearance, and the commensure of the parts have just proportions of symmetry. The commensure, the consonants of the parts, which themselves are symmetrical, will as well be ordered towards the just proportions of symmetry. In other words, beauty exists where the parts of a whole composition are ordered according to the principles of symmetry, which we mentioned before, consonance, and commensurability. It is not enough that something has symmetry, such as we might find in a single element, such as a door or a window or any other element, but it rises to the level of beauty when the symmetrical parts are then arranged amongst each other according to the same principles of symmetry and consonance, such as when we find the entirety of the facade. In musical composition, each note has a consonance, not only with its immediate neighbors, but also with the consonances which have a relation to each other in an analogous way, giving each note a relationship to the whole. In music, when the key changes, the relationship between the first key, or the first set of notes in a scale, is related to a second set, another key, by one of the intervals or ratios that we've already mentioned as consonant, the fifth, the fourth, and the octave. For instance, Bach uses a system of fifths for all of his key changes. In architecture, we see this in the relation between the major and minor orders, each internally consistent and ordered according to the same principles of symmetry, but related to each other. In music, each part is not only consonant with the parts surrounding it, but also to a set of proportions in a particular set, and furthermore related to the composition as a whole, giving the whole of the composition an intelligibility in the same way that each individual consonant is intelligible. So each note, no matter where it is in the composition, has a clearly defined and knowable relationship to the perceptible common measure already mentioned. This is one of the most pleasing things about music, that even when the complexity increases, the intelligibility of the order does not diminish, but remains and is pleasing to the mind to recognize in this order. Dr. Molly Guston, who wrote on music in Tonality, writes that the greater a quantity of different pitches of the composition which possess a single common measure, consonance or commensus, the more tonal the music. And the more tonal the music, the more beautiful it is. Vitruvius recognizes this when he says, symmetry is the appropriate harmony arising out of the details of the work itself, the correspondence of each given detail amongst the separate details to the form of the design as a whole. Here we see that order is not just any arbitrary system, but is one that's built upon the principles of consonance, so that each part has a relationship to the whole that is perceptibly coherent. And here we can see in this is San Pietro in Venice, which was a facade attributed to Palladio. And we can see those musical proportions being used. At least I will show just some of them here used in this facade. Initially we have the 4 to 3, the fourth. We add to it a few octaves, some more perfect fifths, and even more octaves. So we can find is this entire facade was composed much like a piece of music in the same sort of way. And it's composed in a certain way that all of it fits together and makes a unified facade. None of these proportions stands on its own, but it stands in relationship to the whole. A sign that this order is coherent and apparent is that when we listen to a piece of music, even if we've never heard it before in our life, and a musician plays a wrong note, we immediately know it's wrong. It's a wrong note because it does not fit within the order of the whole. The order established by consonants carried throughout the whole piece, and one that is recognizable to the mind without knowing it. For this reason also, Alberti says, beauty is that reasoned harmony of all the parts of the body, so that nothing may be added, taken away, or altered, but for the worse. Which reminds me of a passage in Amadeus when the emperor asked Mozart to remove some of the notes from his composition. There were too many notes, and he says, I can't pull any one of these out. They all fit together perfectly. I can't. It's as long as it needs to be. It's not too long, it's not too short. They all fit together. It's a machine of sorts. Order is thus not just any system of arrangement placed on the parts or of a design or composition, but rather is one that is such that the organizing principles are perceptible and comprehensible to the mind. Definiteness, the last of the three. Definiteness is the quality of something that allows the mind to grasp the thing in its entirety. Aristotle in the Poetics explains definiteness saying, that which is beautiful, whether an animal or any other such thing, which is composed of a number of parts, should not have only these parts properly ordered, but also a magnitude, and not any chance magnitude. In beauty exists in magnitude as well as in order. What he means is that the mind has a limit to its comprehension, which is the ability of the mind to get itself around a subject. If something is too large, then the mind cannot possibly know it. As he says, for the visual grasp of it and its parts does not take place simultaneously, so that its unity and wholeness are lost for the viewer. This definiteness, this comprehension, is important when Aristotle speaks about the necessity of a poem or any such work of art to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Obviously, they relate to order, but moreover, they relate to how the work has a beginning and an end, that the thing has a limit. If a thing has limits, it is fundamentally understandable. The human mind can grasp it. In philosophy, we speak of a definition of a thing when we want to understand it, and to define it is to conceptually place a limit to the meaning of the thing. To define something is to comprehend and understand the thing. As explained before, the comprehension of the underlying rationality of symmetry and of order are the reason why we call these things beautiful. So definiteness, too, is a necessary condition for beauty. Conclusion. What all these properties of beauty have in common is that because of each of the properties, the mind is able to acquire a certain sort of understanding of the beautiful thing. Now, this understanding is clearly the source of where we delight in the beautiful, as both St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle confirm. Aristotle, who states, man by his nature desires to know, and similarly, St. Thomas says that beauty relates to a cognitive power. For those things are said to be beautiful which please when are seen or heard. Hence, beauty consists in due proportion for the senses' delight, and pleasure being the key to learning here, in things duly proportioned and what is like them, because the sense is too a sort of reason, as is every cognitive power. In each of these properties of beautiful things, symmetry, order, and definiteness, a certain sort of understanding is gained of the beautiful thing. However, beauty is not simply knowledge that can be learned from the principles, but is related to the manner in which we come to understand the underlying principles of the beautiful thing. Certainly, the composer or the architect knows the principles of composing a beautiful sonata or designing a building, but the common man, who has no skill in these principles, can still derive enjoyment in the hearing of music or gazing upon such a building. Aristotle confirms our suspicion in understanding in this way that understanding in this way is the key to the pleasure of beauty, saying, the reason for this enjoyment is that learning is pleasant, indeed most pleasant, not only for philosophers, but similarly for other men also. So this manner of understanding the beautiful must be distinct from the way we come to know through argument by connecting first principles by means of syllogisms, but rather the understanding comes through the simple comprehension of the thing by means of the symmetry, order, and definiteness. Speaking of simple consonants, the mind understands that the numbers of the pitches belong together, counting without knowing it is counting. And in the same way, it knows the order of the piece. The mind, therefore, comes to know things simply through the senses. When St. Thomas stated that beauty lies in the eye of the beholder, it's not that beauty is somehow subjective, but rather that in the eye, the rational order of the beautiful is able to be comprehended and understood. The critical factor of beauty is that the way of understanding that all people are capable of as rational beings. Man is able to comprehend the order, the understanding of the hierarchy of music and architecture in an infinitely simple way. St. Thomas, in his Division and Method of the Sciences, says that this belongs to the faculty of the intellect. Intellect first contemplates a truth, one and undivided, and in that truth comprehends a whole multitude. The mind, through listening to a piece of music or seeing a beautiful building, sees and comprehends that ordering, the symmetry, and is able to comprehend the fullness of the thing all at once. This does not mean that music or architecture are somehow heard or seen all at once, but that the rational order of the thing is comprehended and then understood at once. Again, the example of the sour note tells us that even before the music is finished, we know where things should be. Perhaps this is why in classical buildings, the door is where we expect it to be, but in so many modern buildings, we have a hard time finding the front door. St. Thomas further states that the intellect comprehends a multiplicity in unity, meaning that it is at once it can see the causes of all the myriad effects through a simple cause. In the music and architecture, we have stated over and over, it is the rational ordering of the whole to the principles of consonance. Here we may be able to define beauty as related to intellect. Beauty is the comprehension or understanding of complex things by simple means. This is what makes the beautiful so delightful. It is that we come to know things in such a simple way, and especially things which are extremely complex. This is the great gift of beauty, to be able to see and comprehend and enjoy understanding for such a small price. Final thought on beauty is that beauty and the way of knowing that it is a truly divine way of knowing. I believe it is not a coincidence that Vitruvius uses the word venustatis for beauty, given that there are a number of other Latin words he could have used, formosa, species, pulchra. He uses the word that brings forth the image of the goddess Venus. He chooses this word to evoke the image of a divine sort of desire for knowledge and beauty. So too, our word beauty is not coincidentally used for our Christian vision of that divine happiness that we have in the beatific vision, where we know God as he knows himself. St. Thomas says, angelic minds have a power of intellect in that they understand truths in a unified way. This is because the angels, being closest to God, are closer in being to him than we are. But then as humans, we are not inferior in this way of knowing, because we too have this intellect, and through beauty we see in this way. Because intellect first contemplates a truth, one and undivided, and in that truth comprehends the whole multitude, as God, by knowing his essence, knows all things. Beauty is, in a very real sense, a taste of heaven on this earth. Thank you.
And our last speaker today is Luis Astorino, the president and founder of Astorino in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who will be talking about the Chapel of the Holy Spirit in the Vatican City.
I believe this is the one, right?
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your patience. It's been a long afternoon, I know. One of the things I want to tell you about tonight is a fascinating project, and I, as an architect, often wake up and saying, "What the heck? How did you ever get this project? And you know, what did you do with it?" And all that sort of. And I wanted to give you the story of a little bit about why this, how this happened, and why it happened, and what we did do with it. I wanted to tell you a little bit about Astorino. We don't just do religious structures. We are located in Pittsburgh. I am a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and chairman and founder of the firm, and I'm also a Knight of Malta of the Catholic Church. Let's see how this goes. There you go. We're located in Pittsburgh. For those of you who've never been to Pittsburgh, it's a beautiful place, showing where it is. The circles there show our offices. We have about 6 buildings on the water, right there near the point, and we've been there for that location for almost 30 years. A couple of our projects, top left is a new children's hospital in Pittsburgh. It's a $650 million project. The colors and everything are emblematic of children, and they're the ones that told us to make it colorful. It doesn't look like a hospital. It looks like a children's hospital. The next is PNC Firstside Center. It is it was the first silver LEED certified building in the United States, and still the largest. Third is a mixed-use, 3NC Plaza mixed-use building, newly opened, high-rise. It's we did that with Gensler Associates. It is a office building, a hotel, and condominiums. PNC Park, often called the greatest ballpark in America. That's in Pittsburgh. We did that with HOK Sport. We're also working with them on a new arena for the Penguins, which is under construction, and the last is Bakery Square, a $100 million retail project. So you see the diversity of our firm. The first church we ever did from scratch is the one I'm going to show you today, which is kind of interesting. One thing I didn't show a photo of, we are the first restoration architects of Falling Water. We were hired by the Kaufman family in 1986, as well as the Western Pennsylvania Conservatory, to do the first restoration of Falling Water. And then I worked with Edgar Kaufman Jr., the owner of Falling Water, to do a book called House on the Waterfall, which at the time was the largest selling architectural book ever. It still may be. We did all the drawings and things for that book. So we're going to talk about the Chapel of the Holy Spirit in Vatican City. And a little explanation. When a pope passes away, the cardinals are summoned to Rome by the Dean of the College of Cardinals for a conclave that will elect a new pope. After the celebration of Mass each day, the cardinals are escorted to a sealed Sistine Chapel where the voting takes place every morning and every afternoon. In the early 1990s, Pope John Paul II decreed that the cardinals could no longer stay in the halls of the museums during a conclave. For centuries, when convening the cardinals at the Vatican for a papal conclave, they were housed in the halls of the Vatican Museum on bed cots with curtains between them, and their only bathroom being a bedpan. Pope John Paul II decreed in the early 90s that the Vatican must build a new residence, a hotel for lack of a better word, for them to be sequestered. During normal times, though, the residence, now known as Domus Santa Marta, would house visiting clergy and dignitaries. Obviously, looking back in this practice from today's standards, it's unacceptable. It's an unacceptable way to house these dignitaries, particularly for any length of time. Although that was one of the reasons for the living conditions. The quote is to not unnecessarily prolong the conclave, so they didn't want them to be too comfortable. John Paul II reminded the cardinal electors not to allow themselves to be guided in choosing a pope by friendship, aversion, influence, pressure, media, force, or fear. In his 1996 Apostolic Constitution, he wrote, "The cardinal electors in a conclave should have before their eyes solely the glory of God and the good of the church, and having prayed for divine assistance, give their vote to the person who in their judgment is most suited to govern the universal church in a fruitful and beneficial way." This is our first trip to the Vatican in 1992. This is Audrey Virginis Conley, John Conley. Audrey is John's daughter. Dr. Massimo Stoppa, he is the head of the Director of General Services, Technical Services for the Vatican. Myself and my wife, Jean. This was 1993, but in 1992, you can see the cranes behind us. Work began on the Dome of Santa Marta that I mentioned to you a moment ago. It was, and I was startled to hear the excited tone of Mr. John Conley one afternoon, one weekend, the deep baritone voice of my friend John Conley. "Lou, I have wonderful news." This veteran entrepreneur didn't display such enthusiasm lightly, so my curiosity was immediately piqued. "What news, John?" "Lou, Audrey and I have just returned from Rome. We've had a meeting with John Paul II and with Cardinal Sodano. We met to discuss a financial need at the Vatican. The Vatican government wants to construct a residence to house the cardinals during the next papal conclave. They requested my help in raising the funds needed for this project. They are on a short timetable, and things have to move quickly." I was already wondering what massive effort of communication and organization this project would entail for John, a man whose heart was as big as his expansive business concerns. But before my racing mind could completely encompass the implications, he rushed on. "Lou, the Holy Spirit moved me to a big decision. I told the Cardinal that there's not enough time to organize an effective worldwide financial campaign. I told him that I will personally donate the money." "John, you've got to be kidding. This is a very serious commitment," I said to him. He said, "Lou, I'm not kidding. I really felt that the Spirit was prompting me. And Lou, there's something else. I'm happy to offer the financial backing, but I requested your participation as an architect on the project. Lou, you know how much I value your talent, and I told the Vatican that I only had two conditions for this financial commitment. I must be able to stay at the hotel at any time I visit the Vatican." I said, "Okay, that's understandable. That's fair. And number two, I want the best architect in the world to work on it, and you know who it is, and I know who it is. It's you. I'll need your assistance working through this whole thing, so start packing. I want to get over there as soon as possible so that we can begin working together." That was quite an afternoon. So a week later, our first trip, or within the month, our first trip, June 30th, 1933, this photo was taken at our initial meeting. Pictured is John, Cardinal Castillo Lara, who at the time was president of the Vatican government, and myself. I presented Astorino's credentials, and shortly thereafter, he accepted us as a participatory architect on the project. One of the Americanizations we did to the project was the introduction of actual shower stalls, believe it or not, in the bathrooms. The older men were expected to climb over the high walls of these tubs to go in on a handheld shower, and I figured we'd lose a couple of them, tripping on that. So one of the things we did convince them is to put actual showers in. This is the site location for Dome of Santa Marta. It's directly, let me just use my speaker here. The site is right here, directly across from St. Peter's. You can see the axis, actually, of St. Peter's Dome does go through our site. There was no building site available, by the way. This site wasn't available within the walls, so a site had to be made by tearing down an existing building. As construction progressed on Dome of Santa Marta during the summer of 1993, Astorino lent its expertise to the Vatican team. But unbeknownst to us, we were also being evaluated for something much more important in the Vatican. In November of '93, John and I were called to a meeting with Castillo Lara in the Vatican office, in his Vatican office. He reminded us of another building needed for the project. There remained behind Doma Santa Marta a site for a planned, attached but independent chapel. This chapel would be used for Mass during a conclave. It is where all of the sequestered cardinals would have Mass before proceeding to the Sistine Chapel to vote on the new Pope. We reviewed the site plan and sketches done by the Vatican architects, which is on the right-hand side, looking at the site, and this is, of course, Castillo Lara. He then dropped the bombshell. He said the Vatican would like Astorino be the architect. It appeared that after all those months, we had gained the confidence of the Vatican, and they abandoned their plans and asked us to start from scratch. This is a letter from Castillo Lara on the left, and my acceptance on the right. The first letter in brief says, I'd like you, let's see, our desire to, Dr. Astorino. In Italy, by the way, they call architects doctor, which is kind of funny. I even got some clothes delivered from a store. I said, Dr. Astorino. I had to look around and say, who's this for? But he says in his letter, Dr. Astorino, an excellent architect, so appreciated by you, could actively collaborate in this project by preparing the plans for the chapel and its decoration. With respect to this, I would like to know if Dr. Astorino has accepted the task and begun work on it. We would like the chapel, dedicated to the Holy Spirit, to be worthy of the Vatican and this building, which will be for many years the last great undertaking done in the Vatican. Jason is my response, accepting the commission, obviously with honor. Almost until I looked at the site. Now here, as an architect, looking at the site on the left and the slide on the right. Under construction is Doma Santa Marta. On the left is the Leonine Wall from 600 AD. It separates the Vatican from Rome. And as an architect first looking at this site, saying that's a pretty challenging site. I started getting my knees started to wobble a little bit, saying, wait a minute, what the heck are we going to do with this? Well, obviously, the first thing we did was the site analysis. We took a look at the site. The site's triangular. What's the solution to that challenge? I'd have to think about that. How do you get natural light into that site? It would be important to get some light into the chapel, I would think. What do you do with the Leonine Wall? It's a 600-year-old relic, or 600 AD relic. If you tie into it physically, you might ruin it. It might leak. How do you flash into it? What do you do? It was a tough issue. And besides being a relic, also the site is on axis with St. Peter's Dome. The tomb of St. Peter is directly under that dome, and that axis crosses this site. Does that play a part in the design? That was one of the questions that were going through my mind as we began this. So as we look at our design approach, which I thought you might be interested in, we set a chapel in the Vatican. The first thing we do is pray and ask for God's hand in this. Secondly, we look to nature, God's creation, for inspiration. That sometimes, what I mentioned earlier, our work at Falling Water, Frank Lloyd Wright always said, for color, look to nature. And that always stuck in the back of my mind. And in this case, I said, well, there's maybe more than just color that nature has to offer. So let's look into that for inspiration. Let's look at a solution that reinforces the name Chapel of the Holy Spirit. And let's try to research and learn from other Vatican buildings. So let's first look to nature, God's creation, for inspiration. There's a study that I'm showing here of fractals. Fractals are in nature is a rough or fragmented geometric shape that can be split into parts, each of which approximately a reduced size or same size copy of the whole. These things are found in nature: snowflakes, leaves, cauliflower, shells. A coastline is all fractals. And as the more you magnify it, you just see the smaller parts repeating themselves. Second point, look to a solution that reinforces the name Chapel of the Holy Spirit. So studying things done, artwork, as we had seen earlier today. We look at the Holy Spirit and what it symbolizes. And what we came away with here is basically the triangle representing the Spirit, of course, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. And that stuck in our mind. Research and learn from other Vatican buildings. This is the Sistine Chapel. The floor pattern of the Sistine Chapel, you can see the circles in the bigger photograph here are blown up here. And note the presence of what is known as a Sierpinski's gasket, which is also a fractal. You see the triangle. Let's see where we are. I pardon the slide, but it's a repeated triangle again. Many of the floors of the Vatican buildings utilize these complex geometries with hidden theological meanings. A consultant to us on these issues was Professor Ben Nicholson, who has spent a lifetime investigating sacred Italian pavement design. So let's take a quick look at our site. Here's our site. Now armed with the foretold information, we began our design studies. Our first task was to place a triangular grid over the entire site. Site's a triangle, the Holy Trinity, etc. So it's pretty logical. So we put a grid on the site. And Santa Marta's up above, and you can see the Leonine Wall. And then from the sides of the triangles, we started drawing the chapel. Every wall of the chapel, every form of the chapel emanates from the triangular grid, from a side of the triangle. So that allowed the chapel to literally and figuratively grow from the Holy Spirit. Oh, we're in trouble. These are the colors of the floor. The papal colors are white and gold. That's two of the reasons here. With white and green, or white and gold. White, green, and red represent faith, hope, and charity. And the floor is also divided by aisles and the structural system. So then scale models helped the chapel to take shape as we studied it. We introduced computer modeling early on. And I wanted to take a look at, as we got deeper into it, we looked at some symbolism within the chapel. The wall that's adjacent to Domus Santa Marta, we made 7 niches for the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, which are understanding, fortitude, knowledge, fear of God, wisdom, counsel, and pity. As you look at the key plan, that's on the lower right here. And that's a blow-up of it. We looked at St. Peter's, where the axis came from, St. Peter's Dome, and we felt it very important to do something at that point. So as the cardinals are leaving, at that point where the axis of our chapel and the axis of St. Peter's Dome, we decided to place an upside-down crucifix, a piece of sculpture, bronze, that would remind the cardinals of the first cardinal, St. Peter, who said, "I must be crucified upside down. I'm not worthy to be crucified as Christ was." So there's just a couple other thoughts. That's his baldacchino there, some artwork marked A, which we call the Judas tile that cracked. That's a cracked tile. Stations of the Cross. What do we do with the Stations of the Cross? You remember the issue of the Leonine Wall. Well, what we decided to do was, instead of trying to damage this relic with flashing or putting structure up against it, the solution was to make a glass wall that never touched the Leonine Wall but looked at it, and put inside it, on the wall, bronze Stations of the Cross, which are absolutely outside, and landscaping depending on the season. I'm going to show you just a shot of that. There it is, looking at it from inside the chapel out. The stations are on the outside wall, the bronze, and depending on the season, for example, maybe lilies during Easter, poinsettias during Christmas, or things like that happen in these niches. But that is actually natural light. It also became the way for natural light to get into the chapel. As an additional design feature, the columns further develop the organic design of the concept. They're predominantly fabricated in travertine and copper with alabaster shades and brass and bronze highlights. Just as the mystery of the Trinity is multi-layered, so too the columns are designed to reveal successive layers beneath the outer shell of the travertine. All right, we've got all of our ideas together. We're now ready to present. It hadn't been accepted yet, so this was the room. You know, we talk about intimidating. This was the room we had to present in. You can see our drawings and boards, and we're ready. And our models are there. And this is an interesting shot. I don't know how many of you know what a model scope is, but it's a little thing you look through a scale model, and it puts you down at that size and makes you feel like you're inside the space. Now remember, this is 1993, so today we could do it with three-dimensional models and things, but at the time, that was a key tool. But I think Cardinal Castillo Lara was pretty much into it. Several days later, the Papal Commission approved our design, approved us to get started. This was a dinner that we had at the residence of Cardinal Castillo Lara, where after dinner he passed around a book that he asked us each to write our feelings about the chapel design in. You know, for example, it's an honorable day for me today, as I wrote. And then it went around the table, and I got back to him, and he closed it, and he looked at all of us, and he said, now we will put this book in the vaults of the Vatican forever. Just some interesting things. So we began construction. I thought it'd be interesting to show you that. A couple of shots. They mocked up everything for us, for you as architects, or those of you who are architects now. They would not do anything unless I approved it. Upper left is the floor. On the right is an office. That was the first office of the first room in Santa Marta that was occupied. They did that for us and made it so we could have an office. Lower left is the outside wall. The middle lower is a ceiling lighting. The ceiling is flat with this triangular grid about 6 inches away from it. Under each one of these is what they call an incandescent fluorescent light. It's a very warm lighting. It's a tube, but it's incandescent, and it can be dimmed and lowered. So it adds a beautiful glow. Just a couple construction photos as we begin. Craftsmen, because of the complexity of the triangular roof, had to be brought out of retirement to construct the copper multifaceted assets or elements of the roof. There it is, looking at it. We did get to meet the Pope during this trip. Wanted to show you that. This was the crucifix. I remember I told you about the Judas tile at the bottom, but what I didn't tell you about was directly behind the Judas tile is one other window of the chapel, and it's constructed. This is behind it. That's one, and that's one. And what its intent was to create a glow around the crucifix. So that window is a crucifix form that on the outside, because of the shape of the building, is not crucifix, but it creates a crucifix inside. This is a symbol of the Holy Spirit, of the Trinity that we designed. That is done in terracotta in a number of places. Here's the final product. There it is with some chairs. One day, on a visit back, just before it was dedicated, I got a surprise. A sister Latina came to me, and she was all excited. She says, "I have a wonderful surprise for you. Don't leave. Stay right here. I have to go get it." I said, "Okay." So I stayed. She came back, and she had a photograph. I said, "Well, I guess it works." Chapel was dedicated in 1996, October 31st. When we began the chapel, I asked the Cardinal, because of the significance of the Vatican architecture, what he thought the chapel should look like. Should it be contextual? Should it be possibly out of context, like the audience hall next door, the Nervi's? His answer was swift. It should be a chapel that reflects today's thinking. So I thought on that and contemplated, reflected the thinking. At the dedication, I asked him if he thought the chapel did that, reflect today's thinking. His answer was again just as swift. The chapel reflects the thinking of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Several years ago, the chapel was sadly tested, and they elected a new cardinal, Pope Benedict XII, and I received a personal note from Castillo Lara after that conclave, where he said, "Greetings to you." He says, "I remember always you when you visit the Vatican and admire your Holy Spirit Church. Recently, in the conclave, all the cardinals appreciated very much your work and were very happy to have such a nice and inviting place for prayer. Cardinal Castillo Lara was nice to get a note saying that they appreciated it during the conclave. This is just a very, very short little film clip inside to give you a little shot of the Vatican, of the chapel. This was from a public television program. These are looking at the stations. I was able to pick all the artwork, by the way. I was able to pick from the vaults of the Vatican, the Stations of the Cross, the crucifix, whatever, those two in particular. Oops. It wasn't all work while I was over there, by the way. This was when they were restoring the Sistine Chapel. They took me up on the Last Judgment as they were restoring that. I was able to stand at the very top, right there, and there he is. It's as close as a lot of my friends have said I'll ever get to Christ, but okay, 1988. 1988, I visited Rome, and we were in a chapel that he walked by and just shook hands with everyone randomly. This was a shot of that. There's some unintended symbolism too that keeps reoccurring during the floor. For example, there were 13 pieces of tile in the width of the chapel that never intended. It just happened, and there were a number of other symbolisms that have occurred over the years. But I showed you that visit to Rome in 1988, and I'd love to draw and paint, but I didn't do any sketches over there except one that day, and this is the sketch that I did on that trip. Who would have known 10 years later I'd be fortunate enough to have done a building behind that wall as an architect. So my point is, if I can just finish for a moment with that. A good friend of mine, Sister Margaret Carney, she is president of St. Bonaventure College, said to me a number of years after the chapel, she knew it well, she said to me, Lou, I want you to understand something. She said, God chose you to do this chapel. And I've thought about that over the years, and maybe he did, but the thing that I came away with saying that is God never chooses whom you think he's going to choose to do things. And whether you're an architect or an engineer or a professional of some kind, a professor or a priest, listen and be ready, because he may need you. He always picks who you don't think he's going to pick. Thank you.
No, that's, yeah, one of the hard parts is that I guess the way that I present it is it tries to come together at the end. Sometimes requires you to hold in tension some of the terms. I started out with a definition of the analogical as proceeding, what I said is proceeding according to a proper proportion or measure. It is the principle of unity in difference. Basically, it's the principle that unites the part and the whole, the particular and the universal, essentia and esse or essence and existence, the finite and the infinite, where things that are apparent contraries that some people see as contradictories are actually so integrated and mutually dependent upon each other that you can't preference sort of one over the other except to the distortion of both. So it's sort of this principle of unity that unites contraries and yet respects them as also still remaining different. It's sort of, you might see it as analogous to the hypostatic union of the natures of Christ. Like you can't, like you end up in heresy if you focus only on the human nature of Christ or solely on the divine nature of Christ and get rid of the other aspect of it. You have these tensions in existence.
You intimated that historically that was the case in Christian art, and that if we had somehow strayed from that, what do you attribute that?
I guess I see it as a sort of rationalizing tendency in the human mind that in the same way that you see it, there's a preferencing of concepts and ideas and symbols as opposed to as a sort of entry into this world outside of the finite. And it tends to reduce things to, let's say, the three different forms of imagination that I was talking about. It's like perhaps a single point of reference. Let's say this church is going to symbolize the ichthus, this church is going to symbolize this. Everything is subjected to that singular point of unity, to the point where everything else that's inside it is just sort of like, it's just sort of plastered on the wall. It's not integrated. So I think you see it a lot in modern architecture, where the church, in trying to become a symbol, only ends up being a sign. And the architecture, like the difference between, say, Baroque architecture, where everything is sort of art, architecture, and sculpture all integrated into a unified whole. Now the architecture is its own thing, and then you've got maybe a crucifix on the wall over here or a side chapel over here, and so it doesn't really have a unified any unifying principle that respects differences. So.
Well,
artwork in terms of what you're subscribing. And I don't know if you just want to weigh in on that. That's always been sort of interesting to me, the Renaissance corporal sort of manifestation of art versus like medieval, more spiritualized.
yeah, I think the Renaissance was a period of time, kind of like he said in that lecture, where we went very much, it became very much about the body, whereas, medieval was kind of the other way. And I think there are many different ways of depicting what I call holism or holistic abstraction. So I definitely don't pit myself against that. It was, I really love a lot of Renaissance art and architecture. I think what I talked about was, I was trying to be as general as possible and kind of cover the gamut as much as possible, but I think that when I talked about human, it wasn't necessarily literally the physical, I mean, that definitely is part of it, but I am talking about it in more of a spiritual sense. So I don't know, that's probably clear as mud. I don't know if that answers the question, but I definitely am not at all opposed preferentially to Renaissance. I really love the Renaissance. So, but a lot of people do, would say that after that is sort of when the secularism or the ideas that I talked about in the secular architecture started to come into play, even though they didn't really come out for a couple hundred years later, and what I showed with the the Frank Gehry and everything else. But I think medieval architecture, especially Gothic, for me anyway, really encapsulates that holistic abstraction, because it's definitely got the human element, but it's also got the spiritual, and it's not, in my view, too much either way. So.
Thank you, Lewis, for sharing the story. Just the way that I'm still shaking the magnitude of what that work accomplished. But the other three as architects, how have you been able to embody the kind of concepts in your real work that are in practice like that? Felt successful in being able to bring these to bear on the work?
I guess I could say the idea that you can use the sort of the system of musical proportions is incredibly rich. It gives the work that I've designed. Of course, I'm sort of just now starting to set out on my architectural career. I have yet to have anything actually built, but a lot of things designed, and possibly something coming down the pipe very quickly. But I think being able to use the ratios that I mentioned gives it, like I said, a richness and a complexity that you can see. And it's like Mr. Mastorino put up the example of the Nautilus shell that is always constantly shown. And a lot of people bring up the golden ratio. And what that does is it's a continuous proportion that allows you to get the large and the small have a relation to each other. And one of the most amazing things about musical theory and the numbers is that you can always keep that relationship, large and small. Like I said, the single note to the whole thing, the whole composition, they always carries through. I was thinking about, I was listening to the Moonlight Sonata the other day, and Beethoven has this very sweet melodic thing to begin with, and it's very simple. And then there's this frenetic movement as well. But all of the three movements of that piece relate to each other, even though they're they're complete different expressions. And one of the sort of the wonders is you're able to bring all those different parts together. So say you could have a magnificent, gigantic cathedral. Every little part of it meets together. And then if you have a small side chapel that was very simple, but yet it still relates to the whole in the same way. It's by the means of those numbers, and it's tremendous.
I have used the golden mean many times, by the way, and what's fascinating about it is that it has the length, the width, and the height. So you have the proportions of the space, and I walk into a space and I can tell immediately whether it's designed by the golden mean. It's phenomenal. It really is. It is a fascinating tool to use for we as architects. In addition to the thing, I think what you're talking about is fascinating also.
It has a knowability when you see
Yeah,
it.
you know it.
Everybody knows it.
I actually don't have anything sacred built yet. I'm relatively new in the profession. But what I have designed ties into what we've already heard about proportionality and the golden ratio. I mean, that it is something that when you walk into a space, you don't have to understand it to understand it, if that makes sense. I mean, you just feel comfortable in that space, which is what you were talking about in your presentation. And the other thing that I like is, this doesn't necessarily have to do with abstraction, but if you're talking about humanness or like the real, like connecting with the people that are using it, is looking at vernacular architecture. What are other examples of buildings that are around this building that might might converse with it? I really like the Vatican Chapel because that's a very Italian church or a very Roman church when you go into it, despite its modernity, and that's a perfect example of what I would call holistic abstraction because it took it to the next level, but it's still very recognizable as what it's supposed to be. So,
Or do you, I guess simply for myself, I do high-end classical residential architecture and sacred architecture on the side. And most of the sacred architecture stuff that I've designed so far has not been built. It's sort of a schematic design phase. It's something that I focused on when I was in school. I'm sorry. Sorry. So I was saying that I have yet to have any built sacred architecture work, that I work in high-end classical residential design, and the sacred architecture stuff that I've done so far has not gone beyond schematics for particular churches or institutions. But it doesn't, it certainly informs, both levels in the fact that we're talking about this, what I've sort of termed intimacy and distance, that sort of throughout creation there's always a sense of you want to be both at home in the world and yet never exhaust the wonder of it. And what I see in, at least in the classical architecture I do, is that you're using, as we're talking about scales, proportions, moldings, that create that simultaneity of, in the same way that when you're in nature and you see something that's just awe-inspiring or majestic, something that's beautiful in itself, that any time you truly design something beautiful, you're creating that sense of, I guess, congruence between the object that you're looking at and yourself, but also a sense of distance, of separation of the two, that, wow, that is amazing as other. And so in doing sacred architecture, I try to keep that principle in mind whenever I'm designing something.
Going a little bit beyond this idea of beauty and abstraction, another common thread that I somehow found in all your presentations was this idea that maybe there is a sense of open-endedness of the work that kind of brings this idea of sacredness. And I was thinking particularly of the Vatican Chapel, where we're talking about this kind of involuntarily symbolism that occurred. So in a way, there's this idea that the object, the product, is not finite. It allows for future understandings, for future interpretations, for future lives. So basically, it's a living and breathing body. It's not something that it's ended, something that is finite, but rather something that evolves in time. And maybe the fact that we still appreciate Gothic architecture, Renaissance architecture, Romanesque architecture has something to do with this idea of open-endedness of the work. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, or if there are any other ideas related to this comment.
If I understand the question correctly, I personally don't believe in any particular style of architecture, and I think that's one of the problems with, if I might agree with one of the panelists that talked about Richard Meyer's Rome project chapel. He put his style on that because he wouldn't change his style. And it's very out of place. And it doesn't feel like a church. It could be a museum. It could be a lot of things, as we said. I think when an architect gets stuck on a style, I think he's making a mistake. He or she is making a big mistake. I think you have to keep your mind open. Any type of style works. It's like art. You look at a piece of art, you can't just say, well, I don't like it, abstract art. Well, there's some beautiful abstract art. Keep your mind open and look at all types of art, not just Michelangelo or Da Vinci or whatever. So they were all great. But there's different styles, and I think if you keep an open mind about it, you'll find a good solution. There are a lot of things that affect the solution in architecture. Keep your mind open and you'll find the good solution. Style is not a driver. That's my opinion. Yes?
This presentation was so refreshing because it really affirms, when Robert Venturi wrote Complexity and Contradiction, up to that point, the building was either modern or traditional. And although we talk to a priest who signed a church, you want something modern, you want something traditional. But Venturi's point, even though we do many good churches, was it's not modern or traditional. It's both and.
Right.
It's both modern and traditional.
Right.
I think, the Weird project in particular, proves that point. It's clearly a modern building with a tremendous amount of traditional inspiration. And, it points the way for us. Thank you.
You're very welcome. But one of my favorite buildings, speaking of religious buildings, is Ronchamp. Ronchamp that Le Corbusier did in France, the reason I love it is it's timeless. You don't know when it was done. It could have been done yesterday. It could have been done 150 years ago. I mean, and I think that's something to keep in the back of our mind about great architecture. It should be timeless.
Well, yeah, just to add to that, I think that, what you were talking about how, like, the blurring between modern and traditional that I think hopefully we're moving toward is that's the way people used to think about things. There was no traditional or modern. It was simply working with faith as the basis for it, and then letting it grow organically out of what came before, or more accurately, organically out of that faith. So I think, unfortunately, during the 20th century, there was a real disconnect between what we called traditional and what we called modern. I mean, that was a time period, that in the 19th century, when we started naming past styles, when we came up with names like Gothic to describe and categorize things. But I think in that categorization, there's a danger to get trapped just in one quote-unquote style, so.
I might respond a little bit to that and the question I believe you asked on the table about the sort of open-endedness of beauty. I don't particularly like Ronchamp. I don't think it or most of the modernists like Meyer or others can really give us something that is open-ended. It is as if, I believe Kant said, if you know something, if you know it perfectly, it's not beautiful. It can't be beautiful. And I was just looking over some of my notes that I made preparing for this speech. St. Thomas Aquinas said, wonder is a kind of desire for knowledge, a desire which comes to man when he sees an effect which the cause is either unknown to him or surpasses his knowledge or faculty of understanding. Consequently, wonder is a cause of pleasure insofar as it includes a hope of getting knowledge which one desires to have. You have to have a certain sort of distance between yourself and the beautiful thing. It has to be like a piece of organ music by Bach. There's a certain level of complexity there that makes it interesting. When it is, like Meyer's church, very plain and very simple, there's nothing there to get. There's nothing much more than what you see on the surface. And I think when you get to the level of complexity such as you find in, I believe, in the height of it in the Renaissance and in the Baroque, there is like a piece of work by Bach. Every time you listen to it, you hear something different. So every time I say, if I look at San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice, every time I look at that church, something different pops out to me. And there's this infinite ability to go into it and see more all the time. And I think that's the sort of the problem that we have today is we're okay with just sort of standing pat with just something that's kind of nice. And so we're not really getting to that richness that we used to be able to achieve. And I think that richness, implies the richness and the infinitude of God. And that's what sacred architecture really should do. It should inspire that wonder to looking towards the infinite.
We're really running out of time, and there's another session coming up right now.
She had one more question.
Thank you very much. My name is Ami Fadami. I'm an artist, and so on many levels, I want to thank you for your presentations. They were phenomenal. Actually brought tears to my eyes. And I've also studied classical piano since I was 6. So your analogies on music, I think, are they're revolutionary, even though they've been around forever. But my question to any of you is the elements that you've been talking about in architecture, harmony in a musical key and having a certain sense of unity within your work, and these are all principles that as artists, painters, and sculptors we work on as well. And what was also brought up is the synergy between the two things that kind of flow together, but then if you favor one, you kind of equate both. I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing that completely. But my question is that to bring people closer to God and to the spiritual union and this transcendence of beauty in the architecture is also a result of the artwork that's in it. And what I didn't hear talk about all that much was, I don't know, the interior design, the decorations and the artwork that goes in it. I don't know what the state of what state we are in with architecture now and where we're kind of headed, but should there be more of a union between the architects working together with the artists?
I've got to cut
I
it.
just
Hey, guys, I'm sorry to do this to you. I mean, great question. They're all great questions. Come to the reception, and we can talk about them tonight. We've got to keep moving.